All right, we're back from our break, and now we're going to turn from the far west, the farthest west that the Vikings went, and we're going to look to the farthest east that we went, and we're going to look at medieval Russia. And so the Norwegians went to the west and finally to Vinland. It was the Swedes who went to the east, who went to Russia. So we're going to go to the eastward part, and we're going to look at Russia. And we may possibly get all the way through Russia tonight, and let's see if we can do that. I'm looking at a couple of books. This is one of the books I tried to assign to everyone, The Emergence of the Rus, 750 to 1200, by Simon Franklin and Jonathan Shepard. This is an absolutely marvelous book. It is really a wonderful exposition of Viking Rus, the kingdom that the Vikings built in the area that later became Russia. And it is a really wonderful book, so that if any of you have been able to get hold of it, I encourage you to read it. Another thing I'm going to look at tonight is this book, Medieval Russia's Epics, Chronicles, and Tales, which is a really nice collection of primary sources for medieval Russia. As you can see, it is very thick, and it goes far beyond just the Vikings, but it does talk about the Vikings in their origins. And so I'll be looking at some of the chronicles in this as we look at the exploration of the Vikings. So let's kind of look here. We've got Russia being settled here in the east, and let's take a closer look at Europe here. We can see all of feudal Europe, and the area we're looking at is this area of Russia. The Vikings, of course, remember, they all went in the direction they were facing. So the Swedes went in this direction. They went here, all along here in Finland, Lake Ladoga, along here, and they were trading with all these people in actually modern Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, all along here. And then eventually they went down all of these rivers and into Russia. Their goal was Constantinople, because Russia at the time was barren. I mean, it was like the wild, wild west. There was nothing there. It was heavily forested. It wasn't cleared, where there were meadows and plains. There were virtually no cities that were there. There were later settlements that became Viking cities, but the goal of the Vikings all along was Constantinople, which is the grandest city in the world at this time. And Constantinople is right here. I'm sorry, I thought I was looking at the wrong place. It's right here. And the rivers run down. They have to do some portage overland to get down the rivers and get to Constantinople, which is the biggest city. On the other side also of Constantinople are the Muslim lands, Persia, of course, which was filled with wealth and gold and silver and great civilizations. And so this was another goal of the Vikings, to get to that area. And we'll look at some of the commentators who come from both of those cultures and look at what the Vikings were doing. Here is a map of the Viking lands around the year 1000, and we can see the places where the Vikings first settled, and maybe we'll mark them in red. Novgorod up here in the north is one of the earliest Viking settlements, and Kiev in the south, which is almost to Constantinople, is the other important center of the Viking culture. And so they, of course, went down these rivers, and here on the Dnieper going into this river, they would have to carry their boats across. That would be a portage area. And so there are lots of chronicles telling about how they settle in Russia. Well, there were Swedish incursions into the Baltic long before we speak of the Vikings. We really start the Vikings in around 750, but a legendary character called Ivar the Far Wanderer is said to have gone into the area of Russia as early as 650 to 700, and he is part legendary. we know he's legendary because, according to the legends, he conquered Sweden and Denmark and Northumbria in England, and so all of this, of course, has to be legendary. But the part about him conquering Ortriki, which would be east of the Baltic, and Russia and Lake Ladoga, there might have a germ of truth in it, because that's the direction that he went to. He's supposed to have drowned while on an expedition to Russia. Rimbart's Vita Anscarii, which is a saint's life of one of the missionaries in around 870, a missionary to Kurland, says that the Kurlanders, or who are also called the Kori, had in earlier times been subject to the Swedes and had thrown off their yoke and had thrown the Swedes out and then become independent for a while. So there is a legend or a story that the Swedes had been there and then sort of retreated. The Kurlanders certainly defeated a Danish invasion around 850, and Olaf, king of Berka, led a Swedish force against them and burned their fortress of Seaburg. At that point, the Swedes received the subjection of a land called Apulia, which would be a second town. Rybart is echoed by Adam of Bremen, and those two sites exist, the two sites where they were supposed to have gotten hold of, or the Swedes had gotten suzerainty or rule over, were the cities of Groben and Apuole, which would be what the actual name was, and Apulia is a kind of perversion of that. Thus, the Scandinavian interest was there from about 650 to 700, and the Gotlanders of the Swedes were there as partners and not as rivals, according to Jones. And let me read you his footnote that really describes that. The Gutta Saga records that the first Gotlander to make a lasting peace with the Swedes was the legendary king Awer Strabane, who committed the Gotlanders to an annual tribute of silver. Thus the Gotlanders passed of their own free will under the king of the Swedes, so that they were enabled to visit any part of Sweden free and uncircumscribed, without toll, without charges. Similarly, the Swedes had the right to visit Gotland freely, without a wheat tax or other prohibitions. The king should give help and assistance to the Gotlanders whenever they needed or asked for it. Both king and jarl should send delegates to the General Assembly of the Gotlanders, the Gutnalthing, and collect the tribute there. These delegates had to proclaim the freedom of the Gotlanders to travel overseas to all such places as were subject to the king at Uppsala, and similarly and in like manner for those who had the right to visit here in Gotland. Okay, we don't know who Awer Strawlegs was and when he flourished, but it's likely that the saga here preserves a sound tradition. Okay, so that we have at least saga evidence that the Gotlanders and the Swedes worked as partners, and it almost sounds like a kind of feudal arrangement, doesn't it, where there's reciprocal trading rights, that they're adapting that feudal idea of reciprocal rights to the trade. But Sweden was supreme in the East, and this made Sweden supremely wealthy. Of about 200,000 silver coins of the Viking Age discovered in Scandinavia, half were found in Gotland, and these included 40,000 Arabic coins, 38,000 German coins, and 21,000 Anglo-Saxon coins. And here we see some of these coins that were found in that region. This is a Kufit coin. It's Muslim, probably minted in 903 in Samarkand, and it was found in Gotland. Here's another one that's found in Sweden. It is silver. It's a Kufit coin that was found in that area. So these are Arabic coins. Here are some other coins. This is a silver coin of Henry of Bavaria from the 10th century, found in Gotland. So this would have been from Germany. And this one is a Byzantine coin, so that it comes from Byzantium in the 10th century at about that same time. And so we can see the enormous hordes of coins in Sweden and how enormously wealthy the Swedes were from that trade across Russia. Groben today is a small town a few miles east of Libau. It was comparable in the time of the Vikings to Birka or Hedeby, those wonderful trading ports that they had. It was surrounded by earthworks on one side and on three sides by the river Åland. And at the site of Groben, there were graves from central Sweden and Gotland. The Swedish finds were the Swedish finds were military and the Gotlandic were of a civil community, and so this meant that the Gotlanders brought their wives with them. The earliest burials that date in Groben are from 650, and they practiced cremation up until 800. Apuol was 25 miles to the southeast, and this was a Scandinavian settlement on the river Barta, and there were found Swedish arrowheads and a Gotlander cemetery contemporary to Groben. And here on this map we can see where these two are. First, I'm showing you on this map of feudal Europe, and here is Apuol, and here is Groben along here. And so these were major Swedish settlements that acted as entrepôts to the interior and all of the trade goods that are going to flow up here and then into Sweden to make it incredibly wealthy. Later we will see some outposts here in Staraja, Ladoga, and here Beluzo, which is another of the outposts. And reminding you here that Constantinople is the goal across the Black Sea and up these rivers to get to those ports. Wiskaton was also a Scandinavian market town pattern protected by a garrison contemporary to Groben. The river Memel gave it a share in the 9th and 10th century trading from the Dnieper and the Black Sea, and Trousseau, or Elbing, now Elblog, contained finds of Norse weapons and a Viking Age Scandinavian cemetery. Again, this cemetery followed the Swedish and Gotlandic pattern. Further west, the Danes traded with the Wends and the Abodrites, and there was a lot of trade and tribute and plunder. They appear to have been trading settlements, and the wealth poured into Helga and then Birka. And here again we can see Kurland, where these settlements are, and Novgorod and Kiev, which later become the settlements of the Vikings, and along that coast. Here is a Finnish woman, and I had trouble finding illustrations for this lecture, but this is a Finnish woman in kind of folk and traditional dress, and sometimes that traditional dress will go all the way back to the Middle Ages so that you can have at least a hint of how the people that the Vikings traded with might have looked like. Here is a Russian merchant who might be descended from Vikings, coming from these merchants who are trading all over the Vikings. Actually, the clothing that the Vikings wore resembled this kind of clothing somewhat. They wore sort of big pantaloons and a tunic-like dress tied with a belt around it. It's not at all unlike this kind of Russian clothing. And here is a Russian water cart drawn by a horse in a unique Russian kind of harness, and this might have been the kinds of people that the Vikings would trade with, or even the Vikings themselves at this time. Well, the Russian primary chronicle records the calling of the Varangians, and the Russian primary chronicle, the calling of the Varangians really sort of starts Russian history, starts the history of the Vikings, but the Russian primary chronicle is a really unique kind of document in the European world. The Russians did something quite different from the rest of the Europeans. All over Europe, when chronicles were written, they were usually, most of the time, they were sort of left alone and survived as the original authors had written them. In Russia, the sources were treated very differently. The original chronicle was taken, and later on revisions were made to it. It was a monk would take the original chronicle and rewrite the whole chronicle, inserting parts from other parts of Russia, making up parts, changing it where he wanted to change the tradition, and then the original chronicle would be thrown away, so we lose it. And this happened to the Russian primary chronicle over again a number of different times, so that in order to know what the original chronicle was, you have to take the existing text as it exists now, and you sort of have to do an archaeological dig on the text itself, try to figure out what is the earliest text buried in that revised chronicle. And scholars can do that. They're able to do it. But that's the only way you can get back to the original, because the Russians threw out the older ones as they revised it along the way. So we can't go back and check an older version with a newer version unless we try to reconstruct the older version. And so that's the big problem with the Russian primary chronicle. Parts of it were written in the 9th century, parts of it were written in the 12th century, and you have to sort of dig out which was written when in order to see when it was reliable. But let me read to you the calling of the Varangians from the Russian primary chronicle, and tell me what you think of this passage and how trustworthy it is. Okay. The Varangians from beyond the sea imposed tribute upon the Chuds, the Slavs, the Marians, the Ves, and the Kravicians, but the Khazars imposed it upon the Polyanians, the Severians, and the Vyachians, and collected a squirrel skin and a beaver skin from each hearth. Okay, so this was the original incursion of the Rus into that area, imposing tribute on everyone. Then the Slavs, the tributaries of the Varangians, drove them back beyond the sea and, refusing them further tribute, set out to govern themselves. There was no law among them, but tribe rose up against tribe. Discord thus ensued among them, and they began to war one against the other. They said to themselves, "Let us seek a prince who may rule over us and judge us according to the law." They accordingly went overseas to the Varangian Rus. These particular Varangians were known as Rus, just as some are called Swedes and others Normans, Angles, and Goths, for they were thus named. The Chuds, the Slavs, the Kravicians then said to the people of Rus, "Our whole land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us." Okay, what do you think about that passage? Who do you think wrote it? Any guesses? What do you think? The Swedish Rus? Probably the Rus wrote it, yeah. I mean, what is the likelihood that the Slavs said to the Rus, "Come and rule over us. Come and give us law, give us order and government"? Well, I mean, clearly this is a piece of propaganda that the conquerors wrote after the fact, after they conquered it. But now they're saying they want to show themselves being supported and called in to rule the Chuds, the Slavs, and the Kravicians, who they said were, well, anyway, so then the story continues, and clearly, I mean, the bias is very strong toward the Russian Varangians. Okay, then the Russians thus selected 3 brothers with their kinsfolk, who took with them all the Rus and migrated. The oldest, Rurik, located himself in Novgorod, the second, Cineas, in Beluzero, and the third, Truvor, in Izborsk. On account of these Varangians, the district of Novgorod became known as Rusland, or Russia. The present inhabitants of Novgorod are descended from the Varangian race, but aforetime they were Slavs. Okay, so this is a very suspect story. Despite enormous discussion, and the Russians have been arguing about this for hundreds of years, one fact remains: the tradition that the founders of Novgorod and Kiev were Scandinavian, Varangians or Rus, Scandinavians, this remains a fact, that the tradition has been there from the 9th century, that they were the ones who founded the Russian state, and Novgorod and Kiev were the founders of the Russian states. And there are certain factions among the Russians today, and especially the Soviets, who wanted to deny that. I mean, who claimed that it was the Slavs who really founded Russia, and that this is all a myth. But the evidence is very clear and very strong that the Swedes did come. For example, some of the names, we can look at some of the names. Well, let me look at the Divergent account first, and then we'll look at the names. We want to switch books here to Jones. All right. All right. However, in a book written for English readers, Normans is best kept for the inhabitants of Normandy. All right. What is this note? I think I've got the wrong note. Oh, here is the Divergent account. I'm sorry, I was on the wrong page. There is a Divergent account of Rurik's settlement in the Hypatian Codex. They took with them all the Ruses and came first to the Slavs, and they built the city of Ladoga, the modern Staraja Ladoga. Rurik, the eldest, settled in Ladoga, Cineas the second at Bilozero, and Truvor the third in Izborsk. From these Varangians the land of Rus received its name. After 2 years, Cineas died, as well as his brother Truvor, and Rurik assumed the sole authority. He then came to Lake Ilmen and founded on the Volkhov a city which they named Novgorod, and he settled there as prince, assigning cities to all his sons, to all his followers. Okay, so this is, according to this version in the Hypatian Chronicle, it was actually Rurik who founded the city of Novgorod. According to the Russian primary chronicle, it had been a Slavic city that already existed before. So, and we have no idea which of those versions is correct. I'm going to show you from time to time this genealogy that I've made of the royal ruling house of the Russians. I've also posted this on your website, but it's possible that I may have to shrink it down and fix it so you can download it. I haven't tried that yet. But the line of Russian kings, the Rus kings, starts with Rurik, who arrived in 879. And then when Rurik died, actually his kinsman Oleg took over the rule. And then when Oleg died in 912, then Rurik's son Igor assumed the rule, and he ruled until 945. Clearly he was very young at the time that Rurik died, so Oleg took over, and then Igor really starts the dynasty of all the kings, and we'll come back to him. But here is Rurik, the first one who was called by the Varangians into Russia. Now let's look at a little bit of linguistic evidence for that really proves that the earliest settlers had to have been Scandinavian in origin. For one thing, Rus is the Finnish name for Sweden, and so calling the Rus would have used that Finnish name, and Finland is right in between Russia and Sweden, and so the Rus would have been a logical name for the Russians to call them because the Finns were in between. Ruotsi is also the Old Norse rodar. It means rowing or rowing away. It can also mean a waterway, and clearly that's how these Rus came. These Scandinavians came down the rivers and down the waterways. Ruotsi or rodsmen were men of the rowing away, and so these would have been the Rus. The people of today's Roslagen were following the rowing law, and so all of these words that are similar to Rus tend to show that the Rus did come from Scandinavia. Roslagen is a land that is the coastal area of Swedish upland, and in Roslagen they followed the rowing law. Thus the Finns named the Swedes from the land of their home, and in time it came to include all who lived in the land of the Slavs under Swedish sovereignty. Also, here are some other words that indicate that the Rus came from Sweden. Rother is the Old Norse ship. Rothsman is shipsman, and that's another suggestion. Another name that the Rus, or the original Russians, were called were the Varangians. The Varingi, or plural Varingyar, derives from the Old Norse varar, which means pledge or oath or guarantee. And remember, I read you that little passage that said that the Gotlanders and the people of the Rus had made a pledge with each other to both share trade between each other, that to let each other go to each other's land without having to pay tax and to go on and carry out the trade. So there was a pledge between them and an oath between them and a guarantee that their trade would work. And so this may have been the origin of Varangians, those who pledge with each other. The collective suffix ing means men of the pledge, confederates. So the Russian word, and this coordinates with the Russian word varyag, which means itinerant peasants, peddlers. Vara means wares, and so they are tradesmen. They're coming as merchants, and they make a pledge and they come as merchants. The Byzantine and Arabic sources name the Rus Varangians, a term not known in Russia until after 950. So that would have been about the time that the Russian primary chronicle was actually written down, and so they would have used the name from 950 to call them. There was possibly no need for it until the Rus had assimilated into the Slavs. And it may have been the Swedes who attached the name Varangians to them because the Swedes needed differentiation. They would need to know who was a Swede and who was a Rus and Slavic intermarriage group. And so you're having different kinds of ethnic groups developing in the Rus land. The evidence for Swedish activity in Russia before Rurik is both literary and archaeological, so that Rurik is half legendary. He may have been real, he may not have been real, but certainly we know that there were a lot of Swedes in that area wandering through there. They were Viking. They were going there to try to trade and get what they could. Well, there were lots of different peoples in the East. We have an enormous amount, just like in the West, when you had the Franks and the Germans and the Burgundians and all the different people in Europe. Also in Eastern Europe and in Russia, you have a plethora of different groups of people. The Finns, who are called the Chud in the Russian primary chronicle, were in Estland around Lake Ladoga and Onega, and they were around Rostov and Murom. And the Byzantines were in southeast Europe around the Black Sea. The Arabs were south of the Caucasus, with Baghdad as the capital of the Caliphate. And the Khazars were a Turkic-speaking people of Asiatic origin. They lived around the Caucasus to the north shore of the Caspian and the lower Volga and the Don, and also in the Urals and the Crimea, sort of in the area of modern Afghanistan and Georgia in that era. The Khazars had a gift for trade and commerce, and they acted as a buffer against the Pechenegs. We know something about the Khazars, and they're really quite an interesting people. They're Turkic, but they are the only people in history who ever converted as a whole people to Judaism, and they all converted and became Jews as a whole tribe, which is kind of strange and interesting. They were much more settled, and they lived in cities. They were traders and they were merchants. They acted as a buffer against the Pechenegs, ruling from the shining fortress of Sarkol. and they secured the Don portage and the east-west transit of goods. And as I mentioned, they were the only peoples to convert to Judaism. And then we come to the Pechenegs, who are the terrors of this region. The Pechenegs were wild and woolly. They were the most savage of the people, and they constantly attacked everyone. They didn't live in cities. They were the most warlike, and everybody feared them the most. And what the Byzantines did was to play all of these people off against each other. They would pit one against the other and watch them destroy each other. And that's how the Byzantines controlled all of these people. And they tried to do that with the Vikings as well. And so here we see a map where we can see where some of these people are. The Rus and the Slavs are in this area around in here. The Pechenegs, this is another way to spell the Pechenegs here. The Khazars were down here. There were some other Turks, Cumans up here. The Bulgars started up in this area. They end up going down here and ending up down here to the west of Constantinople. But all of these tribes are milling around, going from place to place. They're nomadic tribes, they're animal herders, except for the Khazars, who are more merchants and traders. And so they don't live in cities. I mean, it's really like the wild, wild west out here. I mean, there are no cities, there are forests, there are plains, there's no civilization in this area. They're really merchants. And here, this map shows the territory a little bit further to the south. Here is the Byzantine Empire in the year 910, and by this time the Bulgars have moved down to this area. Well, there are actually two groups of Bulgars. There are the Eastern Bulgars and the Western Bulgars over here. The Khazars are here, and the Pechenegs are here, and so these are the peoples that the Rus have to pass through to get down these rivers. Here is where they have to take the portage, and they go down here, down the Dnieper, and through the Black Sea in order to get to Constantinople. So that's the normal way they get there. And so all of these people have to be managed along the way in order to pass through that area and get to the golden city of Constantinople, which is where the Vikings, the Swedes, all wanted to get to. The Western Bulgars were strong and aggressive and often at war with the Byzantines. The native Slavs in that area later absorbed the Bulgars completely. The Eastern Bulgars, as I said, on the other side of the Khazars, were of Turkic origin, and their main encampment was on the Volga Bend. The Slavs were in the vast central area of Russia, and they were loosely organized and too independent to form a confederacy and drive out these Rus invaders. The Annals of Saint Bertin in France report the arrival at the court of Louis the Pious, King of the Franks, in 839 of Greek ambassadors sent by the Emperor Theophilus of Byzantium, and these ambassadors brought with them men of the Rus. And King Louis interrogated these men carefully and learned they were Swedish. And he then immediately identified them with the Viking raiders who were just at this very time raiding France, and kept them a while until he was sure of their honesty. And then they returned to the north, and archaeological remains have been found around Lake Ladoga. The Swedes, Alanders, and Gotlanders were all sailors, and they set out to find a living and trade and home in the east. And like the Vikings everywhere else in Europe and to the west, in the east, the Swedes set out to find a living and trade and sailed down the rivers from Lake Ladoga, where they had their first settlements. And then they used portage, carrying their goods and their ships from river to river. The Gouda saga informs us that the Gotlanders were in fact exiles, and this would have meant they were outlaws, as so many of the travelers we've seen among the Scandinavians were. They were outlaws. By the closing decades of the 9th century, that would be the 800s, the Swedes and the Rus were of considerable considerable importance in Russian affairs. They were active in trade on the Volga. They were in contact with the Khaganates of the Bulgars and the Khazars, and this is what the rulers of all of these eastern tribes were called. They were called the Khan, is the title for a king of these tribes, and even some of the Rus kings were called Khan from time to time because they assimilated very easily with the local culture. And here we can see this area, the Swedes and the Rus going down the Volga River from Lake Ladoga down this way, and here's the portage over the river, and then they would go down from Staraja Ladoga through Novgorod and down the river portage right through here, and then down the river Dnieper through Kiev and through the land of the Pechenegs and into the Black Sea, okay, in order to get to Byzantium, which was the golden treasure. They were well known also to the Muslims south of the Caspian, who had traveled by camel train from there to Baghdad. And they encountered merchants and trade goods from as far east as China, and Arabian silver, Persian glass, Chinese silk, and along the Silk Road, all of these goods would have been there. Silk purses, spices and wines from India, and all of these goods from the Far East would be exchanged with the Rus for slaves, weapons, honey and wax, furs and amber. On the Dnieper, they founded their city-state of Novgorod from their base at Staraja Ladoga. They had a footing in Gnezdovo, Smolensk, and Chernigov, and they achieved supremacy at Kiev, and those are all places going down that river. And throughout central Russia, they exploited and imposed their will on the Slavs. And here we can see the Byzantine. We've got the Byzantine Empire, which is here. It's not colored in, but these are the Arabian lands, the Islamic lands where the Arabs had first conquered. And of course, the Silk Road goes right through here and through Byzantium and to Constantinople. So this would be, it can go this way or this way down the Silk Road. And so all of these goods from China, from the fabled East, and from Persia would have reached Constantinople, and the Vikings would also be trading with the Muslims coming through this area as well. And so they would encounter all the rich goods of the East. Kiev became the main seat of Rus power under Oleg, and he ruled the Rus of Novgorod, which is not on this map, but we'll look at Novgorod in our other map. Let's look at the account of Ibn Rusta. Okay, Ibn Rusta, writing the first half of the 10th century, tells us how the Rus lived on an island or promontory in a lake, which was large, marshy, forested, and unhealthy. They were much busied with slave hunting. Quote, they have no cultivated land, but depend for their living on what they can obtain from Sakilaba's land, that is, the land of the Slavs. They have no estates, villages, or fields. Their only business is dealing in sable, squirrel, and other furs, and the money they acquire by these transactions they keep in their belts. They journeyed and made war by ship, were excessively valiant and treacherous, were handsome, clean, and well-dressed. And in fact, Ibn Rusta notes the Viking dandies who wear full baggy pants gathered kneewards and vouched for by the Scandinavian picture stones and fragments of northern tapestry, though these may very well have been influenced by Oriental fashions. But the Viking in general was quite a dandy. They were hospitable and protective of their guests, were quarrelsome among themselves, and frequently resorted to single combat to settle disputes. But in the face of a common enemy, they closed their ranks and fought as one man. They had priests and made sacrifices of men, women, and cattle to their god. The method of sacrifice was by hanging. They lived in a state of such insecurity and distrust that a man dare not go outside about his natural needs save with an armed escort. When one of their chieftains died, they made a grave like a big house and put him inside with his apparel and gold armbands and an abundance of food, vessels with drink, and coins. Finally, they put his favorite wife, woman, or concubine inside with him, still living, then closed the door of the grave so that she died. Okay, Gwyn Jones thinks here that Ibn Rushd was describing the Rus of Novgorod, but his picture of a big trading post maintained by force of arms among an alien community must be true of all the cities and trading centers that the Rus had actually founded in the land of the Slavs. Constantine Porphyrogenitus, writing at about the same time in 950, also describes the Rus. And here we have Constantine Porphyrogenitus in his book De Administrando Imperio, is concerned to tell of the convoys of vessels out of the Russian north which descend the Dnieper to Berezani on the Black Sea, and from there make their way to the imperial city itself. The boats from further Russia, that is, from beyond north of Kiev, he tells us, came from Novgorod, where Prince Sviatoslav had his seat, the son of that Igor who had attacked Constantinople in 941 from Smolensk and Chernigov, Teliatsa, and Busagrad. And they traveled downstream till they arrived at Kiev. And maybe we can look at a map while we're doing this. They traveled downstream until they arrived at Kiev. Meanwhile, the Rus of Kiev had been hard at work. Their life, he says, was a hard one, for during the winter they were out on Polyudi, that is, on their rounds, visiting the Slavonic people, the Varians, the Dregovicians, the Krivicians, the Severians, and others who paid them tribute. Some paid in money, some paid in furs and other commodities, and there was always a use for slaves. In April, with the thaw, they returned to Kiev. The town stands on a series of bluffs on the river's bank and is unaffected by the spring floods, which raise the river's level as much as 16 feet and increase its width from less than half a mile to 5 miles or even 6. From April till June, the Rus found it unnavigable, but after their return from their rounds of tax collecting, they needed this length of time to transfer usable gear and parts from their old boats, hollowed out of a single tree, to the new ones prepared for them by the Slavs, and make all shipshape. By June, the river was manageable. It still ran with more than its normal flow, but this served its purpose. The fleet now moved a short way downstream to the stockaded taxing post of Vidichev, and after a day or two, all the boats sailed off to face the perils of the voyage together. These were of two kinds, these perils: the natural hazards of the descent, which were worst at the rapids, and the risk of ambush by the Pechenegs, which was at its most acute on the same stretch of river. The emperor is eloquent on the perils of the 40-mile succession of cataracts which the mighty river is compressed, where the mighty river is compressed between walls of granite. It was to get over or past the rocks and boulders here that they needed the high water of the June season. Now the Rus go into the water naked. Some feel the way with their feet. Others ply their stout staffs at prow, amidships, and stern. Now they unload their cargoes and use their slaves for a 6-mile portage. Now they appoint sentinels, lest the same fate befall them as befell Prince Sviatoslav in 972, when the Pechenegs slew him near the rapids and made a drinking cup of his skull. Okay, so these are the kind of dangers that they had to do. They actually named all of the cataracts on the river going down, like Skull Crusher and Drowner and Drinker, and they named them all these terrible names as if they were demons, living in the falls of the river as they went down the side of the river. Well, when the Rus reached Constantinople, they were flabbergasted by the luxury, the size, the wealth, the luxury, the huge, beautiful city full of artwork. In the 860s, Askold and Dir, the first rulers of Kiev, sailed a fleet against it, and it is said they were routed by the prayers to the Virgin, which brought a destructive storm. And in fact, the Byzantine Patriarch of Constantinople dipped the cloak of the Virgin in the Black Sea in order to ward off the Vikings, and it was the Virgin who sent the storm that drove away their ships, according to the legend. So Askold and Dir were the first rulers of the city of Kiev, and here we can see Kiev is the base that they went down these rivers to get to Constantinople. And I'm going to show you some pictures of Constantinople. I don't have I don't have a lot of color pictures of Constantinople. This is actually Venice. This is St. Mark's in Venice, but it's very Byzantine, and so this is the kind of glorious building they would have seen in the huge city of Constantinople, which would have been like New York is to the United States. I mean, it is a massive metropolitan area with beautiful, beautiful buildings like this glorious kind of cathedral. And it's very Byzantine. Look at the domes on top and the spires. It's quite Byzantine in character. Inside it would have this style of decoration. This is a Byzantine basilica inside, which is huge. You can see how big it is by the size of the people down here to compare it to. Covered with glorious golden, bright colored mosaics everywhere, and along the walls, and huge mosaics and beautiful tile floors and Greek columns, very Greek in nature. This is actually a Byzantine church in Ravenna. It's a cathedral church. It's just a glorious one. San Vitale in Ravenna. It's an imperial church because the emperor had built this beautiful church, and if you can see it, it is just you can see the brilliant colors on the walls of the mosaic. This is all gold. It looks sort of greenish, but it's actually all gold in background, and everything is marble. It is just a magnificent church. These are the kinds of mosaics you would see on the wall. Imagine this in beautiful, bright colors and brilliant artwork on all the walls. And here's another example of the kind of art that would be on the walls of the Byzantine cathedral. And in fact, this is one reason why the Vikings converted to the Greek Orthodox religion, because they were so amazed by the richness of the city and the glory of it all. This is actually a replica of a Viking ship that was brought to the World's Columbian Exposition in celebration of Columbus in the 19th century. And so this is a 19th century replica of a Viking ship flying the American flag, by the way, which is interesting. I think this might be the Swedish flag. Does anybody know the Swedish flag? I think that might be either the Swedish or Norwegian flag here. In 907, King Oleg led a fleet also against Constantinople, and King Oleg was the uniter of Kiev and Novgorod. And here we have Oleg, who is the successor of Ruruk, and then when Oleg died, Igor became king. Oleg led a fleet against Constantinople. Oleg was the uniter of Kiev and Novgorod. He brought a fleet of 2,000 ships and 80,000 men, according to the Russian primary chronicle. I really doubt that number, and the chronicles often exaggerate incredibly. And so, whatever the case, I mean, I doubt that he had 200 ships. That would have been an enormous amount. Nevertheless, when he tried to sail against the walls of Byzantium along the seashore, they were too hard to breach, and he couldn't get around them. So what he did was drag his ships up on land and put wheels on them and sail them against the walls of the city, because he thought they would be more vulnerable there. He failed, however, and so he was not able to attack the city, not able to conquer the city. Nevertheless, he did make a treaty with the Rus, with the Byzantines, and here is the gist of the treaty as it's reported in the Russian primary chronicle. The Russians who come hither shall receive as much grain as they require. Whosoever comes as merchants shall receive supplies for 6 months, including bread, wine, meat, fish, and fruit. Baths shall be prepared for them in any volume they require. When the Russians return homeward, they shall receive from your emperor food, anchors, cordage, and sails, and whatever else is needful for the journey. Okay, the Greeks accepted these stipulations, and the emperors and all the courtiers declared, if Russians come hither without merchandise, they shall receive no provisions. Your prince shall personally lay injunction upon such Russians as journey hither, that they shall do no violence in the towns and throughout our territory. Such Russians as arrive here shall dwell in the St. Mamas quarter, and our government will send officers to record their names, and they shall then receive their monthly allowance, first the natives of Kiev, then those from Chernigov, Pereyaslav, and other cities. They shall not enter the city save through one gate, unarmed, and 50 at a time, escorted by soldiers of the emperor. They may purchase wares according to their requirements and tax-free. So it was kind of a reciprocal contract, wasn't it, this treaty? It's a trade agreement made with them that from that time forward the city of Constantinople was going to be open to the Vikings, but they had to check their weapons at the gate, and they had a soldier escort so that they wouldn't do anything bad in the city. They also had to pay tribute, 12 silver coins for each oarlock on their ships. Well, in 941, Prince Igor led a fleet of 10,000 ships. Liutprand of Cremona says 1,000 against the city of Constantinople, and at this point they were destroyed by Greek fire. Okay, looking at our chart again, we have Igor, who is king after Oleg, and he is the founder of this line of kings. In 944, Igor returned with a horde of mercenaries and ships, and he was beguiled with gifts and promises. And in 945, a new treaty was signed, and this time with many Slavic names, although some of the names were still Norse. But the Treaty of 945 now shows that either there were lots of Slavs in that Viking army, or as the generations are going on, the Vikings are adopting Slavic names. And this may be because they're marrying Slavic women, or because they're assimilating into the Slavic culture. But now we find all these Slavic names in the treaties. Here is a naval battle showing the use of Greek fire. Does anybody know what Greek fire is? Have you heard of it before? It's a chemical that the Greeks, it was a secret weapon. Nobody even knows the formula to this day of what they exactly used, but it's a chemical that you spray on the water, and when it touches the water, it bursts into flame. And so they can burn up the ships of their enemy by using the Greek fire. So here are the Greeks, and they're actually attacking I think they're attacking Muslims at Madrid in this particular picture. Igor's son then, Sviatoslav, whose mother was Olga, a Christian, then succeeded Igor, and here is our chart again. And so Sviatoslav succeeded, but look at the date, 972. Yaropolk was his brother, and Oleg was his brother, and Vladimir was his brother. So remember that they practiced partible inheritance. So the first thing they all did was go to war with each other, to fight each other off to see who would win. And among the sons, it was Vladimir who won. He died in 1015. Notice the others died at all in the 970s, so they killed each other off. Anyway, so we'll come back to that in a moment. I want to read you Olga's character, because Olga was a Christian, And there was a miraculous birth of Sviatoslav, because Sviatoslav was born when his father Igor was 75 and his mother Olga was 60. And so this is a miracle that happened because Olga was a Christian. And here is Olga's character. Let me read her character. Well, let me read, let's see. What happened is that Oleg was killed, and he was actually killed by some of the people who are there. Who are the people who killed him? No, they didn't kill him. He died. After Oleg's death, Igor became the ruler of Russia. He was neither successful in his military enterprises nor popular with the people. Okay. Igor then died when he was killed by the Darolevians. Okay, the Darolevians heard that he was again approaching and consulted with Mal, their prince, saying, "If a wolf comes among the sheep, he will take away the whole flock one by one, unless he be killed. If we do not thus kill him now, he will destroy us all." And so they killed Igor. And so Igor was buried. They killed him and all of his men. So Igor was buried, and his tomb is near the city of Izkorostan in Deriva, even to this day. But Olga, his wife, was in Kiev with her son, the boy Sviatoslav, the boy of miraculous birth. His tutor was Asmund, and the troop commander was Svenol, the father of Mishtushta. The Darolevians then said, "See, we have killed the prince of Russia. Let us take his wife Olga for our prince Mala, and then we shall obtain possession of Sviatoslav and work our will upon him." So they sent their best men, 20 in number, to Olga by boat, and they arrived below Borichev in their boat. Okay. Olga was informed that the Darolevians had arrived and summoned them to her presence with a gracious welcome. When the Darolevians had thus announced their arrival, Olga replied with an inquiry as to the reason of their coming. The Darolevians then announced that their tribe had sent them to report that they had slain her husband because he was like a wolf, crafty and ravening, but that their princes who had thus preserved the land of Deriva were good, and that Olga should come and marry their prince Mal, for the name of the prince of Deriva was Mal. Olga made this reply, "Your proposal is pleasing to me. Indeed, my husband cannot rise again from the dead, but I desire to honor you tomorrow in the presence of my people. Return now to your boat, and remain there with an aspect of arrogance. I shall send for you on the morrow, and you shall say, 'We will not ride on horses nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat,' and you shall be carried in your boat." Thus she dismissed them to their vessel. Now Olga gave command that a large deep ditch should be dug in the castle with the hall outside the city. Thus on the morrow Olga, as she sat in the hall, sent for the strangers, and her messengers approached them and said, "Olga summons you to great honor." But they replied, "We will not ride on horseback, nor in wagons, nor go on foot. Carry us in our boat." The people of Kiev then lamented, "Slavery is our lot. Our prince is killed, and our princess intends to marry their prince." So they carried the Darolevians in their boat. The latter sat on the cross benches in great robes, puffed up with pride. They thus were borne into the court before Olga, and when the men had brought the Darolevians in, they dropped them into the trench along with the boat. Olga bent over and inquired whether they found the honor to their taste. They answered that it was worse than the death of Igor. She then commanded that they should be buried alive, and they were thus buried. Okay, so here we have another example of a typical Viking woman who was Olga, and she was a Christian, and she did, I can't read you the whole story, but she tricked them again and again, and she finally ended up conquering the Darolevians, and so she was just an incredible woman who was very powerful, and as a Christian, she then had the influence of really bringing about the conversion of Russia. She was a hardy campaigner against the Khazars, the Vyatovichi, and the Bulgars. The Pechenegs took Sviatoslav's head in 972 and made it into a drinking cup, as we said. Sviatoslav again divided his realm among his 3 sons, and once again they fought savagely over it. And here is Sviatoslav. who then has 3 sons. Wait a minute. Sviatoslav fights, and then he has 3 sons, and who fight over it. Maybe I've got these wrong, but this was the one I found. But Yaropolk, okay. Here we have Yaropolk slew Oleg. I have them all as brothers. I wonder how I did that. Okay, Yaropolk slew Oleg and then died himself. Vladimir, with the help of an army recruited in Sweden, succeeded to all of Russia. Vladimir ruled from 980 to 1015, and he converted to Christianity. And I won't read you the whole story of his conversion. Here is Vladimir here, who died in 1015, and these are all his sons. He had 3 sons here who became, each in turn became king, and 9 others beside that. So he had loads of sons, which is kind of interesting about him. But he converted to Christianity, and the story of his conversion is really interesting because supposedly he sent representatives to all the major religions, to the Roman Catholics in the Catholic countries, to the Jews, to the Muslims, and to the Byzantines. And the story goes that each one of them had something that was difficult for him to deal with. Among the Roman Catholics, the Pope would impose his will on them. Among the Muslims, they were forbidden to drink, and of course the Vikings couldn't tolerate that. Among the Jews, converts had to be circumcised, and so that, of course, was something unthinkable for these Vikings. But the Byzantines, according to the story, the Byzantines had churches that were covered in gold and silver and were gigantic buildings, and the Mass was sung with heavenly music with heavenly pictures on the walls, and incense everywhere, and the sound and the smell of heaven. They thought in the churches of the Byzantines they had already gone to heaven. And so that's why Vladimir chose Byzantine Christianity. But we have to mark the fact that his mother was already a Greek Orthodox Christian, and so that could have had something to do with it. He also had been trying the Vikings had been trying for generations to make a treaty with the Byzantines, and so he actually did it in a very Viking way for convenience sake, because the Byzantines were the best allies that he could have. As a result of his conversion to Christianity, he helped the Emperor Basil II put down a rebellion by Bardas Phocas, who was a Byzantine rival to the throne, and then Vladimir married the emperor's sister, who was very reluctant. She was extremely unhappy because Vladimir already had 800 concubines, and so she didn't see a very good life for herself there, but she was forced to anyway. But Vladimir was a very smart, intelligent man, and one of the things he did that was really worked well for the Russians was he made the language of his new church Slavonic, not Greek or Scandinavian. And so that meant that the Greeks could not have control over that church. It was a church that would be separate from the Greek Orthodox Church, and it would be ruled by his own Slavonic churchmen, and everything Greek had to be translated into Old Slavonian. He educated the children, and let me read you this passage and see what you think about it. It's a quite interesting passage of what he did with the children, and I want to see what your reaction is to it. Okay. Okay, hereupon Vladimir took the princess and Anastasius and the priests of Kherson, together with the relics of St. Clement and Phoebus, and selected also sacred vessels and images for the service. And then he founded churches in the midst of the city, and he found and appropriated bronze statues and 4 bronze horses, which now stand behind the Church of the Holy Virgin. As a wedding present for the princess, he gave Kherson over to the Greeks again, and then departed for Kiev. When the prince arrived at his capital, he directed that the idols should be overthrown, and that some should be cut to pieces and other burned with fire. He then ordered that Perun, one of the gods, should be bound to a horse's tail and dragged along Barachev to the river. He appointed 12 men to beat the idol with sticks, not because he thought the wood was sensitive, but to affront the demon who had deceived man in this guise, that he might receive chastisement at the hands of men. Okay, the idol was being dragged to the river. The unbelievers wept over it, for they had not yet received holy baptism. And then he sent heralds throughout the whole city to proclaim that if any inhabitant, rich or poor, did not betake himself to the river to get baptized, he would risk the prince's displeasure. So Vladimir had the whole city baptized by the order of the prince, a forced conversion. When the people were baptized, they returned each to his own abode or home. Vladimir, rejoicing that he and his subjects now knew God, he himself looked up to heaven and prayed the prayer, and then I won't say the prayer. Then he began to found churches and to assign priests throughout the cities and to invite the people to accept baptism in all the cities and towns. He took the children of the best families and sent them to schools for instruction in book learning. The mothers of these children wept bitterly over them, for they were not yet strong in faith, but mourned as for the dead. When these children were assigned for study, there was thus fulfilled in the Russian land the prophecy which says, "In those days the deaf shall hear the words of Scripture, and the voice of the stammerer shall be made plain." Well, what he did was take all the children away from the parents of his nobles, take them away and put them in school and have them indoctrinated in the Christian religion. And so at one fell swoop, he not only converted a whole generation, but he also educated a whole generation. And so this was a very important step, educating the children. Now, the next important king was Yaroslav the Wise. Vladimir himself was succeeded by all these sons who went to war. We had a couple who ruled in between, but Yaroslav was the main one. Yaroslav the Wise is the one we're going to end with, and he had all of these sons, and all the descendants of Yaroslav ended up ruling all the different cities of Russia. He actually divided Russia among them all so that they all ruled different cities of Russia. But Yaroslav the Wise, from 1019 to 1054, succeeded him. He married Ingigerd, the daughter of Olaf Scott-Cunning, King of Sweden. So there is a momentous marriage between the King of Russia and the King of Sweden. He welcomed the dispossessed King Olaf Haraldsson of Norway, the future Saint Olaf, to his court, and he also gave refuge to Magnus Olafsson and to Harald Hardradi after Saint Olaf's defeat at Stiklestad. Olaf was killed at Stiklestad, by the way. That's how he became a saint. Harald Hardradi recognized Yaroslav the Wise as liege lord, and Harald Hardradi, who was king of Norway at the time, married his daughter Elizabeth. So what the king of Russia is doing is joining all the crowned heads of Scandinavia and becoming an equal with them. He's ruling a Scandinavian kingdom which is the equal of Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and England at the time also. Others of Yaroslav's other daughters married the King Andrew I of Hungary and King Henry I of France. And in fact, his daughter Anna is called Anna of Kiev. She was the only educated person at the court of King Henry I of France, and she had to read everything to everybody in the court. 4 of Yaroslav's sons married into the courts of Byzantium and Germany. So his children married all the crowned heads of Europe, whether they're daughters or sons. He built the first Russian cathedral after defeating the Pechenegs in the 1030s, and he started that distinctive style of Russian churches, and I'll show you one of those in a minute. He brought the Chud under control, and remember the Chud were the Finns, in fact, and enlarged his boundaries to the west. He was sort of like another Charlemagne in Russian guise here. His hold on the Dnieper trade routes was now absolute, and the national coffers of Russia bulged and overflowed. He also imported artists and architects to adorn Kiev with frescoes and mosaics, so he must have imported them from Byzantium. Although, you know, the Rus were completely awed by the wealth of Byzantium, but if you look at the wealth of the Persian cities and the kind of art and architecture they have, it's fully as splendid as Byzantium. So they're really blowing up Byzantium all out of proportion. Nevertheless, the affinity he chose was with Byzantium, and he brought in scholars to translate all the greatest works into the Slavonic tongue. He clarified and recorded the laws, and in fact he wrote the law code down for the first time, which was a very Scandinavian act to write down the law code. He built the first library at the Church of St. Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, in either Kiev or Novgorod, and so he had then transformed the kingdom, which is one reason he was called Yaroslav the Wise, because he had so much emphasis on building and education. We have a sort of renaissance going on, a mini bright spot here. Let's look at some of the buildings of the Byzantines. I don't have the ones that Yaroslav built, they're not there anymore. But here is the throne of Russia and the kind of glorious ornamentation that you see on actually there are 3 thrones there in the throne room of the Rus. Here is a typical cathedral that you would see built in the Russian kingdom, and you can see this really distinctive architectural style which partakes of the Byzantine style, but also it has a kind of Muslim look to it as well in the architecture. This actually was built to commemorate the defeat of Napoleon, so it's much later, but this is the distinctive kind of culture that the Rus developed. I have a couple more to show you. I didn't have time to Xerox them, but maybe Don can zoom in on this one so that you can see this distinctive church at Novgorod and the distinctive kind of Russian architecture that developed. And then let me put another one there, and you can see this is an extreme development of the kind of church architecture that eventually developed. Moscow itself called itself the Third Rome. This is the church at Moscow. That is a result of the conversion of Vladimir and the fact that Vladimir linked the Russian kingdom to the Byzantine Empire, so that eventually when the Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, the Russians felt that the crown had been passed to them and that they inherited the whole Russian culture. There are Russian Orthodox churches here in town. If any of you are interested in partaking of the Russian Orthodox ceremonies, they partake of the Byzantine tradition, and the churches are filled with Byzantine icons, which are very like this one that you can see, the kind of Russian icons, which are very like the Byzantine icons. But let's get back to our question, was this a Viking kingdom? I had asked the question after describing what Vladimir and Yaroslav the Wise did, can you still call this a Viking kingdom? Yes or no? What do you all think? Is it still Viking, or has it become something else?
It wasn't Viking. It became something else.
Okay, why do you think, why do you think it's not Viking anymore? Why do you think it's not Viking? What evidence are you depending on?
Well, just art itself became a whole different evolvement of art and culture. Aesthetically, it was completely different.
Aesthetically, it's different. Yeah, they're building in stone. They're building really different artistic styles. They're speaking a different language, aren't they? They're speaking Old Slavonian instead of Old Norse now. Anybody want to argue that it's still a Viking or Norse kingdom? What evidence is there to argue it's still Viking and Norse? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying one can argue either side. Any evidence that it's still Viking and Norse? What do you think?
The way that the kings inherited, where all the kids would had to fight it out.
Yeah, all the kids would slug it out together when the old king died. Yeah, so that was very Viking. And that kept on. Yeah, under Yaroslav did too. Anything else that's Viking about it?
Weren't the bloodlines actually from the Norse leaders?
They were. We trace the line with our little chart all the way from Rurik, and so they're all Norse. And Olga, in fact, is a Norse name. So Olga and Igor are both Norse names, and so. But then we have some Sviatoslav and Yaroslav, and suddenly we have some Slavic names coming in there. So, but that. I left out part of the genealogy, and some of them were marrying local women, Greek women or Slavic women or Pecheneg women even, and Khazar women, and so but these were probably concubines. Remember, Vladimir had 800 wives and he had 12 sons. So and we don't even know how many daughters he had. So this was very, how about the law code? Don't you think writing a code of laws was very Viking? On the other hand, the way he organized the government was very Byzantine. He was taking Byzantine organization and organizing the church. He set up the church.
An argument against is the way that he did so many treaties and farming out his children, and that didn't seem very Viking. Or farming out his children to other, not farming out, but marrying off his kids to other.
Yeah, marrying off his children, so that you have sort of political alliances that he's forming with these marriage alliances. Yeah, that seems to be of a different order than the Viking use of marriage. So we've got a kind of amalgamation of Slavic and Byzantine and Viking culture. Well, we've just run out of time. So next week, we did finish the Russians. We'll go on to England and Normandy and see what's happening there next time.